The rain had been tapping against the windows of the little cafe for the better part of an hour, and I sat at the corner table, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm latte. I liked this spot mostly for its quiet. The way the chairs didn't scrape too loudly against the floor, the faint smell of old books mixing with coffee grounds. The kind of place where you could fold a napkin 3 times over and no one would notice. She walked in like she always did, that subtle sway in her step that made me glance up even before I realized it. The bell above the door jingled, soft, polite. I'd never heard anyone else say late again the way she did. Not as a reprimand. More like a tease that left a strange warmth crawling up my chest. "Your usual?" she asked, as if she hadn't noticed the rain, the empty streets outside, or that I'd been here 20 minutes early. Her voice carried this quiet certainty that made me feel, momentarily, like I belonged in the frame she'd just set. "Yeah," I said, and she raised her eyebrows just slightly. She could make a look feel like a sentence, and for a second, I had to remind myself to breathe. She set my cup down in front of me, and her fingers lingered on the handle longer than necessary. I watched, mostly pretending not to, as her eyes flicked to mine and then away, checking something on her phone. I caught the ghost of a smile at the corner of her lips. I took a sip, letting the coffee burn a little at the edge of my tongue, just to stop thinking. I thought about all the messages I never sent, the words paused halfway through drafts on my phone, the texts I deleted instead of pressing send. She didn't know any of that, of course, but sometimes I imagined her noticing anyway. "You're late again," she said, finally, leaning against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "Maybe you can make it up to me differently." The pause after those words was enough to make my stomach tighten, and I had no idea if it was excitement, dread, or something I'd never had a name for. I laughed softly, awkwardly, looking down at the latte, my fingers tracing the rim. "I'll try." She tilted her head, one eyebrow raised, and something in the quiet between us stretched just long enough that I could hear the clock ticking behind the counter. I felt her eyes on me, flickering over my hands as I absently folded the napkin into a smaller square, then unfolded it again. "Tomorrow, then?" she said, voice soft but deliberate. "Yeah," I murmured, barely loud enough for her to hear. My heart felt both like it had stopped and like it was thrumming somewhere inside my ribs I didn't know existed. She moved to leave, her coat brushing against the floor. For a moment, she turned back, a glance that wasn't really a glance, more tether. I caught it, held it in my chest, replayed it in my head even as she stepped outside, the bell jingling once more. The rain had slowed, but the air still smelled of wet asphalt and possibility. I picked up my cup, noticing for the first time the way my fingers remembered the warmth of her hands, the faint scent of jasmine on her coat. The thought came unbidden. Tomorrow, maybe, I wouldn't just be late. Maybe I'd find a way to stay in her orbit a little longer without realizing why. And then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "See you tomorrow. Don't be late." I stared at it for a long moment, letting the words sink in, and for the first time all day, I wasn't alone in the quiet. The next evening, I found myself at her apartment building, the umbrella dripping at my feet as I fumbled with the keys. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and old carpet. She was there, holding the elevator door, casual as ever. "On time," she said, the words light, but somehow heavier than usual. She tilted her head, watching me struggle with the keys. Or almost. I managed to smile. "Better than last time." She laughed softly, and it was strange how ordinary it made everything feel, like this was normal life, except that it wasn't. Inside, she poured tea. I hovered near the counter, unsure if I should sit or stand. She noticed and gestured vaguely toward the small table by the window. "Sit." "You're shaking the cup." The steam curled between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but ended up staring at the delicate swirl of tea leaves. Then she spoke, almost to herself, but not quite. "My mother used to make this," she said. "Early mornings, always too quiet. I'd sneak the sugar." She smiled, the faintest crease forming at her eyes. I think that's why I still like it. I nodded, pretending to sip, but really listening. It was a fragment, small, but it landed somewhere inside me. You always remember the little things, I said before I could stop myself. She looked at me, a flicker of something passing in her gaze. Approval, amusement, maybe a warning. I notice what matters, she replied. Then she paused, almost hesitating. Even when people don't. I felt that familiar tug of tension, the quiet knowing that this wasn't just friendly. My mind raced. This was her building, her rules, her life, and here I was, 20 years younger, teetering on the edge of something I wasn't supposed to want. I imagined scenes that would never exist, imagined her laughing at some joke I hadn't told yet, imagined. She caught my eyes lingering on her hands as she stirred her tea, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. But the air between us felt taut, like we both knew we were standing too close to something fragile. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, and handed me a stack of envelopes, slightly trembling. It was trivial, but as I aligned them neatly, our fingers brushed, a fleeting touch, enough to make my chest tighten. She didn't comment, and neither did I, but the gesture lingered. We sat in silence after, the rain tapping against the window again, the kind that makes you notice every heartbeat. I tried to focus on the steam curling from my cup, on the quiet ticking of the clock. But I couldn't stop imagining her next move, the soft way she might tilt her head, the almost imperceptible shift of her shoulders. Finally, she leaned back, eyes catching mine for a moment longer than necessary. "You're different," she said quietly, almost to herself. Not teasing, not joking, just stating it. I wanted to answer, but nothing seemed adequate. Instead, I smiled a little, and for some reason, that felt like a language we both understood. When I left later, she opened the door just a crack. Her hand brushed mine as I slipped past. Nothing said, everything implied. The warmth stayed with me, and I realized I didn't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I didn't see her for 3 days. Not that it mattered. The building hummed with its usual quiet. The mail slipped through the slot. The drip from the sink sounded too loud in my empty apartment. I kept replaying our last moment, the brush of her hand, the tilt of her head, and I wondered if I'd imagined it. When I finally saw her again, she was in the lobby, keys in hand, her coat still damp from an unexpected drizzle. She didn't smile at first, just raised an eyebrow, the one that always made me feel like a misstep could be fatal. "You're here," she said, flat, almost accusing. "Early, though." Something changed. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Thought I'd check in." The words sounded smaller than I wanted them to. She glanced past me at the elevator. "The tenant from 3B is moving in today," she said. "Busy morning. Don't get in the way." I nodded, even though I hadn't planned to, and followed her upstairs. She carried the new tenant's box like it weighed nothing, but I could see the tension in the way her shoulders flexed. I kept my distance, hands stuffed into my pockets, unsure if I should help or retreat entirely. Inside her apartment, she poured tea again. The aroma hit me first, then her presence, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of her shampoo. She didn't offer the cup, just set it down, and sat opposite me, her eyes flicking to the window. I wanted to say something that mattered, but instead, I watched her fingers trace the rim of her cup. Small movements, quiet, intimate. "I should check on the tenant," she said finally, almost to herself. I wanted to protest, wanted to say stay, 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 but I didn't. I imagined her walking out, the door clicking shut, and my chest tightened. My fingers drummed lightly on the table, hoping she'd notice, hoping she'd stay. When she leaned forward to sip her tea, our knees brushed under the table, a fleeting, electric contact. She froze for a fraction of a second, then moved away, careful, deliberate. I can help," I said, voice trailing. "No," she replied immediately. Her eyes softened just enough to make me doubt my own ears. "I've got it." The silence after was thick, like the room held its breath. I wanted to lean closer, wanted to bridge the gap, but my hands remained clasped, unsure. I watched her exhale slowly, hair falling just enough to shadow her face. A noise from the hallway, a dropped box, a hurried apology from a neighbor, startled us both. She straightened instantly, the moment evaporating. I leaned a little closer anyway, just to hear her better, just to feel the warmth that shouldn't be mine. She caught my movement, her eyes widening, a subtle intake of breath. Our faces were inches apart. I imagined, for one impossible heartbeat, our lips almost touching. Almost. Then she blinked, shifted back, and the electricity was gone, replaced with the faintest flush on her cheeks. I swallowed, caught in the quiet tension, knowing that whatever hung between us now was fragile, dangerous, and maybe, in some quiet way, inevitable. I left her apartment with the taste of unsaid words and the weight of near confession pressing in my chest, the echo of what almost happened chasing me down the stairwell. I found her on the small bench by the park behind the building, the sky bruised with early evening. She was alone, legs crossed, a notebook balanced on her knees. I hesitated at the edge of the path, hands in my pockets, listening to the faint scrape of her pen against paper. "You came," she said without looking up, voice low, almost cautious. "Yeah," I murmured. "Thought, maybe you wanted company." She didn't answer at first, just kept scribbling, the pen moving steadily. I shifted closer, careful not to overstep, and noticed the way her shoulders tensed slightly when a jogger passed, the brief flicker of awareness in her eyes. I wanted to reach out, to ease something I couldn't name. "You've been distant," I said finally, voice breaking against the quiet. I regretted it instantly. She paused mid-word, looked up, and the world narrowed to the space between our faces. "I'm not distant," she said softly. But her hands betrayed her, tightening around the notebook, the knuckles pale. "I'm careful. Careful." The word felt too loud, too desperate. I wanted her to look at me, to see the way my chest ached with something I hadn't allowed myself to name. She swallowed, eyes dropping. I shouldn't want this." The confession, so quiet, so fragile, caught me off guard. My stomach knotted, heat rising along my spine. I imagined her words lingering in the air, pressing against the park bench, against my chest, against the spaces between us. "Why not?" I asked, voice barely a whisper. My fingers itched to brush the hair from her face, to reach across the gap, but I froze. She exhaled slowly, letting the notebook rest on her lap. "Because it's not simple," she said. She glanced up, meeting my eyes for the first time in minutes. "Because I'm older. Because," she faltered, "because you could get hurt." I shook my head, almost laughing nervously. I don't care." The words felt like too much, too little, and I cursed them as soon as they left. But her gaze didn't falter. It softened, then hardened again, like she was testing me, testing herself, testing the distance we both knew we shouldn't cross. I imagined pressing closer, imagined her letting me, imagined everything that could happen if we ignored the rules, if we forgot the world outside the park. And yet, something in her posture, in the subtle shake of her shoulder, warned me. I wanted to ask if she felt it too, the quiet pull, the slow burn, but the words lodged somewhere between my throat and my chest. So instead I just watched her, silent, the only sound the faint scrape of her pen as she tapped it against the notebook, trying to focus, trying to keep control. I noticed the way her thumb brushed the page again, absent-mindedly, and I realized I had memorized these tiny motions already. She finally looked up, and for a heartbeat, the park disappeared. "Do you want this?" she asked, voice trembling, but not quite asking. I opened my mouth, but the words refused me. The question hung in the air, delicate and dangerous, waiting for someone to answer, waiting for someone to step over the line we both knew existed. The next week, she was different. Not cold, exactly, but distant in the quietest ways. The brush of her hand across mine that had lingered too long before, gone. Her glances, once teasing, now brief, distracted. Even the laugh that had held the warmth of an inside joke felt clipped. I tried to show up. I left messages I never sent, rehearsed what I might say if she noticed me waiting outside her building. But she wasn't there. The cafe, the park bench, the little routines we'd started, all felt hollow. Then I heard it from someone else, almost accidentally. A neighbor, muttering over mail. Her daughter called. She's visiting this weekend. Daughter. I hadn't considered that. The possibility had existed somewhere in the back of my mind, but I hadn't let it occupy space. And yet now it did, pressing against every unspoken thing between us. I imagined her telling me, imagined her eyes avoiding mine, imagined me fumbling through words I couldn't trust. I imagined the way she'd hold herself differently, how her life, a life I only brushed the surface of, might not have room for me. I thought about showing up anyway, waiting, leaning on the thin thread of hope that maybe she'd want to talk. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at the messages I'd typed, deleted, retyped, hesitated over. One evening, I left a note in her mailbox, folded precisely. Careful. I'll be around if you want to see me. Nothing else. No name. No signature. Just folded paper and intention. She didn't respond. I passed the park bench we'd claimed as ours and saw someone else sitting there. Not her, not me. A jogger, earbuds in, oblivious. The quiet ache of absence settled around me like smoke. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence, leaving the words dangling in midair. The next day, I waited outside the building, hoping, imagining her code in the hallway. But she never appeared. The door stayed closed, the mailbox empty. I replayed every moment, every tiny gesture that had once been weighty, the brush of a hand, the almost smile, the leaning closer that didn't happen. I imagined her thinking about me the way I had thought about her, and wondered if the timing, the circumstances, the invisible rules we'd never spoken aloud, had pulled her back before we ever really started. I wanted to knock, to ask, to bridge the space. But my hand hovered near the door and then fell. I walked away slowly, past the little cafe, past the park bench, past the drip of rain from an overhang. The day felt suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. At home, I opened my phone and stared at a draft message, half-written, "I don't know if you want to see me," and left it there. Unsigned, unsent, unfinished. And for the first time, I realized that sometimes the weight of waiting, of not knowing, was heavier than the weight of any words I could muster. I found her in the kitchen, standing over the sink, a faint smell of lemon in the air. The apartment was quiet except for the drip of water from the faucet. I lingered in the doorway, hands stuffed into my pockets, unsure if I should knock, announce myself, or just disappear. She didn't turn. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the tight line of her jaw. The notebook she had always carried now sat closed on the counter, abandoned. For a moment, the room felt too small for both of us. "I didn't think you'd come," she said finally, voice soft, more observation than greeting. "I had to," I said. My own voice sounded foreign, heavy with all the drafts of unsent words I'd left to gather dust. She leaned back against the counter, arms crossed loosely, eyes avoiding mine. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I think I do," I said, stepping closer. I wanted to reach for her hand, but stopped halfway, letting the hesitation linger. "I just need to say it." She let out a breath, almost a sigh, almost a warning. "Then say it. But don't expect it to fix anything." I swallowed, the weight of months pressing in. The glances, the brushes of hands, the silences that spoke louder than words. "I don't care about anything else. I want to be here. With you. Even if it's wrong. Even if it doesn't work." She didn't answer. She didn't look at me. But I could see the way her fingers flexed against the counter, the subtle shift in her stance, the small intake of breath that betrayed everything she was holding back. I'm afraid," she said finally, almost inaudible. "Afraid of what this means. Afraid of what I want." I nodded, though it felt like nodding wouldn't mean much. I took a careful step closer, letting the space between us shrink just enough to feel the warmth of her presence without crowding her. We stood there, quiet, breathing differently. The rain outside tapped lightly against the window, unremarkable and steady. I realized that everything I had imagined, every worry, every hope, had led to this moment. Simple, raw, fragile. Finally, she let her hands drop to her sides. Her eyes flicked toward mine, and I saw a softness I had almost forgotten existed. "Okay," she said, voice small, deliberate. A single word, and yet it carried more than any confession, more than any gesture. I smiled, tentative, a little awkward, but it felt like something genuine. I reached out slowly, brushing the back of my hand against hers, not demanding, not insisting, just acknowledging that we were here. She didn't pull away. Not fully. Not yet. And somehow that small contact, a touch, a word, a shared space, was enough. Enough to know that what had been suppressed could finally breathe, even if only a little. The kitchen smelled of lemon and rain. The room was quiet, but in that quiet, everything shifted. And for the first time, I felt the tension lift, not with words, not with promises, but with a simple, human connection. Weeks passed. The city moved in its usual rhythm. Early buses, the faint hum of construction, the way the coffee shop always smelled faintly of burnt sugar. I walked past it one morning at exactly 8:47 a.m., and I almost smiled when I saw her sitting at the corner table, black coffee in hand, notebook open, a pen resting across the page. She didn't look up, and I didn't expect her to. We had settled into a rhythm of our own making. Not every moment was seamless. Not every glance loaded with intention. Sometimes she teased me about being late. Sometimes I lingered, hoping she'd notice when I hadn't. But there was comfort in that predictability, in the quiet certainty that she was there, and I was, too. I found her later that afternoon on our park bench, the one near the old oak tree that had witnessed our first awkward silence together. The bench had a small chip in the paint, and the rain had left the wood slightly slick. She laughed at something on her phone, a soft, unguarded laugh that made me forget how long I'd been holding my breath. I didn't need to be asked to sit. She nodded toward the empty space beside her. I perched there, knees almost touching, hands in my lap, pretending to care about the way the wind tugged at the corner of my notebook. "Tea?" she offered, pulling a thermos from her bag. The faint scent of jasmine reminded me of the first cup she had poured for me weeks ago, the one that had begun this slow, quiet shift in both of our lives. "Please," I said, and we sipped together, in silence, letting the ordinary intimacy of shared tea fill the spaces between words. The world was still messy, still unpredictable, but here, on this chipped bench, with her hand brushing mine for a fraction of a second, it felt steady. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. There was no need to explain every feeling, no need to justify every glance or pause. We were both older now, weathered a little by uncertainty, but softer in ways we hadn't been before. I noticed her fingers tracing the rim of her cup as she often did, just as I used to watch, memorizing the small gestures. She caught my eyes on her hands and flicked a glance toward mine, subtle, acknowledging enough. I realized I didn't need grand confessions anymore. Love wasn't a line to be crossed, a sentence to be spoken aloud. It was in the quiet, in the unspoken, in the way she remembered the way I liked my coffee or the exact time I got to the café when I wasn't late. When she stood to leave, I followed slowly behind, not rushing, not holding my breath. We paused at the elevator. She gave me a look, a small, knowing lift of her eyebrow, just enough to say everything we didn't need to. And then the doors closed, and I walked home, feeling the weight of something earned, something real. Later, I thought about that first brush of hands, the first awkward glance, and the long stretch of silence between us. I smiled quietly, remembering the thermos, the bench, 8:47 a.m., black coffee, and the small, ordinary gestures that had quietly shifted everything. Some things only we would ever understand. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next? Stories where emotion grows in the small moments, not the grand gestures?